Welcome to my new space. Today we're going to be talking about something that you may not want to talk about. A company that I'm sure you do know, but that most of you don't know actually made sailboats. We've talked in the past about what might be the most hated sailboat or the most controversial sailboat ever made. And a lot of time, at that time anyway, we were joking about Hunter, and no one likes Hunter, or maybe McGregor. And we probably weren't far off with that. A lot of people don't like those boats. But there's another name in the worst sailboat ever category. A sailboat so ugly, only its mama could love it. This week on Everything You Need to Know, we're talking about Bayliner. Yes, I said Bayliner. And what comes to mind when you think about Bayliner are probably little bow riders you see all over the lake every Saturday. Everyone's favorite small, cheap, and easy to own little runabout. Or maybe the mid-size range of the tube and water ski pulling powerboats that fill the swim hole every weekend. The brand Bayliner, at least in the circles I've traveled in, has always been known as a very cheap and somewhat less reliable, less well-made powerboat. They seem to be the budget boat compared to Doral or Four Winds. But if you want a cheap and easy little boat, Bayliner does seem to fit the ticket. But aside from being at least 25% of the powerboats we see out on the lake every weekend, did you know at one point they also took a crack at sailboats? Yep, sailboats. And it didn't go perfectly. It was the early 70s and the world was going through what at the time was dubbed an energy crisis. The Middle East had, at the time, for political reasons, put an oil export embargo on the West and some other countries as well. And as a result, it got hard for you to find a gas station that had enough gas in its tank to let you fill your tank on your wood-paneled station wagon. The gas shortage led to a crisis in North America, and while our whole world had changed as a result of it, we saw a huge movement at the time to buy more fuel-efficient cars. And as a result of that, the big three automakers started making smaller cars with smaller engines. Everyone was sort of selling their 396 SS to buy a little four-cylinder Corolla over the next 10 years, and it didn't just impact the automotive market, it hit the boat market as well. Enter Bayliner, a man called J. Orrin Edson, a powerboat dealer, and had a lot of success. He started selling powerboats in 1955, and he was doing so well as a dealer that he had worked up enough capital and success to break out into the boat manufacturing game. And he bought the Bayliner name. Now, when the oil crisis hit in 1970 and people weren't buying fuel-hungry powerboats anymore, he knew he had to do something to stay afloat. Yeah, afloat. He saw the success of the sailing world through the 70s. Everybody that was buying a brand new boat in the late 60s, early 70s during the fuel crisis, powerboats were not selling, but people were still buying sailboats. Powerboaters were even trading in their powerboats to get a sailboat to avoid the fuel issue. So he tooled up to make some sailboats under the Bayliner brand. He would call them the Bayliner Buccaneers. Sounds like a football team. That's a football team, right? There was a lot of sailboat manufacturers that were really earning their name in the 1970s. In different niche markets of the sailing world, you had brands like Island Packet and Bayfield building cruising boats with big keels. Then you had Columbia and CNC trying to go fast and win races. But Bayliner didn't really target a specific market. Instead, they just sort of made copies of already existing boats. The early Buccaneers were based on two different Columbia designs of all things, the T-23 and the T-26. But Bayliner put some effort into modifying the design a little bit, and they put their powerboat knowledge to use, and they made the interiors better, more comfortable, and more powerboaty inside, more cushions and things like that. What's said, though, is the thing they sort of ignored when they were modifying the designs was sailing performance. I guess they just couldn't be bothered. Lady K Sailing is brought to you by patrons, people who give a couple of bucks an episode to keep this channel improving. This week I'd like to give a shout out to the newest patrons. We got Bart, David B, Tom, and David F. Thank you so much for making this all possible. So Bayliner got started into the sailing world making sort of lackluster boats, like the Buccaneer 180. Buccaneer 210, the 240, the 270, and the 320. They made boats right up to 33 feet with Doug Peterson designed Buccaneer 335 that they had. The early boats were, let's say, not pretty. Some people appreciate the design and argue that the boats have their own unique character, but ultimately the high freeboard and sort of bathtub-shaped hull never amounted to any sort of competitive sailing, shall we say. In later years, Bayliner tried to make the boats more appealing, and they got some solid Doug Peterson designs, which is a big name and a great place to go for some good designs. Most notably, the Buccaneer 295 and the 305. The direction change was interesting because the 295, the design of that boat was actually intended to be a half-tonner IOR race boat. You can usually tell an IOR boat, and I have one, so I do know a lot about them, like the 295, because they have what's called a pinched stern. It's basically the stern comes up to the transom, which is a small triangle. And when you view these boats from the back at water level, they sort of look like they're pregnant. Is it just me that sees that? The 295, or 300 was also produced, was a big departure from Bayliner's old Buccaneers that were ugly and just silly, and actually wasn't a slow boat. At just shy of 30 feet with almost 6 feet of keel, it was a solid little racer, and the Bayliner version of that design had a fairly good interior, because that's kind of what they do. This Doug Peterson design was so good that it was actually made by a bunch of different companies. There was the Chaser 29, the US 29, US Yachts version, which Bayliner owned, and then the Bayliner versions with a nice interior. So it was a great design little IOR race boat. So if going from the ugly little cruisers they started with that didn't sail very well and looked like bathtubs to a full-on IOR half-ton race boat wasn't a big enough change for you, Bayliner also flipped the script again when they released the 305, a William Gardner design 30-footer. The 305 had no interest in racing, but it wasn't ugly either. Instead, it put itself in the comfy weekender class of sailboats. Gone was the pregnant IOR hull and the pinched transom in favor of what I kind of look at as more like a hunter-looking boat. Flat transom, flat-sided little cruiser. The 305 had more focus on interior, as was Bayliner's way of doing things, with accommodations like a double quarter berth, reasonable galley with a stove, a head with a shower, and a double V-berth. For a weekender-style lake sailor, you honestly wouldn't be disappointed with the Buccaneer 305. They aren't bad. A lot of Bayliner sailboats were made throughout the oil crisis, and there are a lot of things said on the internet and by surveyors about them. Most of those things are bad. The build quality always seems to be referred as good enough, and that ranges from the glass to the layup and the interior and the rigging. But say what you will about the Bayliner line of sailboats, it's not all bad. A few of the designs like the 295 were actually very fast and fun to sail. There's lots of good things said about that boat. The more cruising-oriented versions like the 305 are very comfortable and very safe, very pragmatic and realistic little weekender sailboats. And maybe a powerboat manufacturer had no business trying to break into the sailboat game, but what would you have done if it was your company? So it's the early 70s. It's the oil crisis, and you can't find a gas station to fill the tank of your car. You have a wildly successful powerboat company. Bayliner saw the writing on the wall. People are going to stop buying powerboats for a while. They just are. Now, Bayliner could have folded up the operation and been lost to history, but they didn't. They came up with a bold, almost crazy idea and said, let's just make sailboats for a few years. And you know what? It worked. Bayliner survived the oil crisis, and when it was over, they respectfully shut down production of all their sailing line. They went back to what Bayliner does, making that thing that they know, powerboats. Can you imagine what the lake would look like on the weekend right now had Bayliner had thrown in the towel in 1970? Who would pull the skiers? Who would pull the tubes? Who would make the bow riders? Bayliner may be the name you see on every other little powerboat that goes by you in the channel, but it almost wasn't because of the oil crisis. It almost didn't happen. Now, you may not love Bayliner, and you may think that some of their sailboats were the ugliest ever made, and you might be right, but you do have to admit, it's one hell of a success story.